Whispers rippled through the kingdom of Valoria like serpents through tall grass. The Briarwood was dying. Once a beacon of life in the northern wilds, the ancient forest now throbbed with a cancerous malice. Hunters and woodsmen returned changed, their eyes pools of unnatural shadow, their mouths twisting into gruesome parodies of smiles. Birds that dared venture beneath its eaves dropped from the sky like stones, and rivers that kissed its borders turned thick and black as tar. In the heart of Valoria, sheltered behind high walls and the valour of their knights, many dismissed the tales as fear-soaked imaginings. They were fools. Elowen wasn't, but this knowledge brought little comfort. She was a simple village healer, skilled in the binding of wounds and the brewing of tinctures. Yet since childhood, when a travelling mystic touched her brow and declared her touched by the old, she'd seen things, flickers of the arcane, faint threads of energy most dismissed as tricks of the light. She saw these threads wither and darken within the Briarwood's corrupted branches, felt its insidious poison seeping south with every chilled gust of wind. "It's nothing," scoffed Aldrich, Valoria's master of arms, after she dared voice her fear to the local captain. His dismissive scowl had become familiar over the years. To them she was simply loony Elowen, her gift nothing more than a mad woman's fancy. She clenched her fists, the urge to hurl harsh words as potent as any healing poultice burning her tongue. The dead deer carcass that lay between them was proof enough that this wasn't mere fevered imagination. Its fur had sloughed off in clumps, eyes replaced by a sickly greenish glow. Elowen had felt that cold darkness lurking within the beast's core before even a blade was drawn. "If it's nothing," she retorted, fighting to keep her voice from cracking, "then why not send your own scouts into the wood if you deem this such a trifling affair?" Silence hung heavy in the clearing, broken only by the rustling of nervous guardsmen. Aldrich didn't rise to her challenge. He was no fool, just prideful. Valorian steel solved their problems, not the panicked pleas of an outcast herbalist. She left them to their counsel, the dead beast like a weight in her stomach. If they wouldn't act, wouldn't even see, then a solution, however ill-formed, must come from her. There were older powers than steel, and Elowen was bound to them, whether she willed it or not. But those powers lay dormant, as elusive as the half-heard whispers of spirits she used to chase as a child. Tonight, though, their call was an insistent drumming against her very bones. Her steps weren't her own. She found herself skirting the outskirts of the village with uncanny certainty, drawn towards a moss-covered path usually only braved by children chasing fairy tales. The moon painted the trail in shades of eerie silver, highlighting the way as if beckoning her deeper into the night. Had her dreams of helping been warped by this, whatever force thrummed within the surrounding gloom? Perhaps. Yet an unexpected calm steadied her breath. Her fear wasn't for herself, but for those nestled safely in their beds, too blinded by normalcy to even comprehend the creeping threat to their lives. The trail ended at an unremarkable copse of trees. Under the dappled moonlight, however, they formed a rough archway, their branches twisting inward with an unnatural sense of purpose. An ancient wardstone rested in the centre, hidden from casual gazes by an overgrowth of thorny vines. Most would see just that, another relic left by long-forgotten folk. Elowen saw it for what it truly was, an anchor. Something about this spot pulsed in tune with that restless power coiled within her. The faint thrum became insistent melody, and Elowen found words pouring from her lips in a tongue forgotten by modern-day speakers. An incantation, drawn from the depths of her, from some distant ancestral bloodline she'd been cautioned against her entire life. The old magic was deemed as unpredictable as it was potent, used and then twisted by some long-extinct race in ages past. Yet even within her caution bubbled a familiar exhilaration. There was knowledge here, woven into the very bark and stone before her, if only she dared reach for it. As her final word hung in the chilled air, the wardstone shimmered. It didn't shatter as she half expected, but shifted, the moss receding to reveal etchings like a skeletal hand clawing its way towards the surface. These weren't runes of healing or protection, but a key. Though to what, not even her instinctual magic could quite glean. She ran a trembling finger across the glyphs, an icy shock racing up her arm and igniting that old power coiled deep within. This was beyond healing. This was the domain of binding, of summoning, and potentially a terrible unmaking. Her head spun with images. vast winged creatures that blotted out the sun, their roars shaking mountains, warriors shimmering with primal energy, channeling it not to heal but to rend flesh and bone. Elowen's knees buckled under the onslaught. There were echoes of a pact here, old bargains carved into the very roots of this world. This path led further, into realms only ever heard of in half-whispered fables around sputtering hearth-fires. Her retreat wasn't an act of self-preservation, but an oath etched upon her soul. To bargain with such entities. It was madness. The weight of what she held within her now was far, far beyond village remedies. No wonder some of her ancestors were branded cursed and shunned, and no wonder their warnings carried such bitter truths. Yet retreat didn't mean inaction. Elowen had been an outcast too long to rely on the kindness of those who scorned her gifts. With her heart clenched against a torrent of doubts, she hurried back to the village. There had to be more, not just visions of ancient pacts. Surely they'd left texts, hidden knowledge to navigate this shadowed pathway if ever called upon again. Elowen's steps faltered only when she glimpsed the first wisps of dawn painting the horizon. This might be her final night living an unremarkable life, her final hours within familiar surrounds. There had always been an archive deep within the main house, an ancient room smelling of musty parchments and dreams long deferred. Legend held that even the first Valorian rulers knew this collection contained more than just trade agreements and treaties. Here, hidden between pages brittle with age, Elowen might find not just an understanding of how this new darkness emerged, but perhaps a tool to fight back. This, she told herself, was why that primal song drew her so irresistibly to the shadowed archway. Now the path wasn't just about her thirst for forgotten knowledge, but survival. A single oil lamp provided illumination within the archive, casting flickering shadows against the rows of books and scrolls. No amount of cobwebs could obscure the sheer magnitude of history here, and neither would age fully hide what Elowen sought. There were accounts of battles long forgotten, of heroes whose names now adorned bridges and cobblestone squares, but what drew her gaze were volumes bound not in leather or decorative metal, but gnarled bark and woven vines. There, written in the angular scripts of old, were fragmented histories of those who dared speak with what slumbered on the edges of this world, of ancient spirits and beings, known only through names that were themselves potent spells. It was dangerous, foolish, perhaps even life-ending, but the alternative would bring its own form of slow death, as the rot in the Briarwood turned loved ones into hollow-eyed mockeries of themselves. As the first hint of the market bell filtered through the archive's silence, Elowen's finger grazed a glyph upon an opened scroll. That same primal power flickered, not in fear, but in recognition. Her ancestors weren't just touched by ancient magics, their blood still resonated with a call from long, long ago. This scroll, partially burned and tattered, spoke not of summoning some winged godling, but of a vow carved into the earth's very bedrock. This wasn't about wielding forgotten power, but reminding others of an echo, and of the strength of oaths even time struggled to erase completely. It appeared on her tongue at first, the ancient phrasing a stumbling thing amidst the common speech of Valoria. Aaron Sharay Law. Her voice barely rasped out above a whisper. There was an answering hum deep within, not through her ears, but felt as a vibration in her core. Was the earth listening, or something? Older? Each uttered syllable became easier, as though guided by something far wiser than her own troubled heart. This invocation brought no blinding light, nor a sense of crushing dread as her earlier contact with the wardstone had. It was, quite simply, the feeling of being witnessed, observed, assessed. It left her heart pounding. But an unexpected clarity focused her thoughts. Her role in this was simpler than she'd envisioned, just not easier. This ancient oath was to those slumbering beyond the veil, not in servitude, but in watchful slumber. Their strength, bound to protect this region in ages past, had weakened as mankind drifted from old ways, forgot whispers in the wind and the subtle shifts of light upon ancient mounds. Elowen was of that bloodline, tasked not with summoning some fickle djinn, but to become a beacon, reigniting that long-neglected bond, to act as a medium, channeling their might into this realm once more. There was risk in this, in acting as a conduit for spirits both vengeful and wise. In becoming an anchor between worlds, she stood upon a precipice, her spirit the rope and the stakes, immeasurable. Yet within that risk also hummed an odd resonance. This pact predated kingdoms and conquerors, and the very darkness encroaching from the corrupted Briarwood could only truly be repelled with a power even older. Valoria stood as a bastion of civilization against the encroaching shadow, They faced this encroaching evil with blades of steel and sturdy shields, with grim faces and whispered prayers to their patron gods. Elowen wasn't that kind of warrior, that much was painfully clear. But she saw this now, through the dust-covered wisdom of this room. Her strength lay in being just an ordinary healer who'd stumbled onto a bloodline older than stone fortresses and royal lineages. And perhaps, by embracing her role as conduit, she could give Valoria what their steel armour couldn't. "Let this oath be heard again," Elowen spoke, not as a plea but a demand upon the quiet air of the archive. It was a call to arms unlike any ever shouted on the battlements above. Her voice wasn't just directed at the unseen forces she summoned, but was echoed inwardly to the heart that for too long had trembled and doubted. There was courage to be found not in battle cries, but in daring to believe the impossible when that was all they had left. There was no outward sign of this inner shift, no sudden crackle of magic around Elowen, just the dusty light playing in the air motes and the steady scratch of her pen as she scrawled a letter upon parchment. No time for fancy flourishes or eloquent excuses. She didn't write pleas for understanding, only urgency. "Shadow of Briarwood is not natural blight. An old threat stirs and grows." Her hand ached from the swift penmanship, but she could waste no time on flowery descriptions, only blunt necessity. "Seek me at sundown by the Stone of Ages beyond the northernmost watchtower. Come armed, but with minds open. Leave mistrust behind. And hurry," she added in a messy hand at the bottom. No one in their right mind would heed this missive. To those she left it for, Captain Lorien, who tolerated her more than most, and Lady Mara, an elderly scholar often accused of the same madness Elowen now courted. This would reek of desperation or worse, outright betrayal. To her it was simply the only action her newfound knowledge commanded. The spirits would answer, that much she was sure of. She'd felt their gaze stir even now, like slumbering giants yawning upon waking. But whether those of Valoria would hear her call, let alone take a gamble on whispers over weapons, remained a bitter question in the back of her throat. With that done, there was an odd serenity amidst the swirling uncertainties. She walked through the sleepy morning market not like a woman walking to her doom, but a healer making her rounds. It wasn't false bravado, but faith born of necessity. Even amidst the bustle of ordinary life, Elowen carried within her the quiet echo of those she called, an imprint of earth itself, of a rumble below the surface far heavier than any marching battalion. This power terrified her, and it brought clarity and strength in equal measures. Yet in her heart a fear far more human simmered, even while she greeted familiar faces. Would any come? Trusting an outcast with something bigger than a sprained ankle or a stubborn cough required a kind of faith most in Valoria had misplaced long ago. As the sun began its relentless descent and villagers retreated behind locked doors against the unnatural gloom of the Briarwood, Elowen made her way towards the Stone of Ages. An unassuming rock half buried in time, it wouldn't even catch a passing ranger's eye. It was, she knew, far older than anyone truly realized. Beneath its rough exterior lay the etchings of the original oath, and it was here, within this circle, that her summons found its intended target. She stood there, an insignificant smudge against the fading horizon, the weight of history settling upon her thin shoulders. There were, for now, only murmurs beneath the surface. They would need flesh and blood if they were to have enough power to push back the shadow. In her pouch, beside her usual tinctures and herbs, was another, far older talisman, an amulet passed down through her lineage, not with pride, but in wary silence. It thrummed with that same primal earth magic, and if her summons failed, this small item would be a last desperate attempt to tap directly into that ancestral energy before it could consume her utterly. She prayed there'd be no need, prayed someone would come, not out of belief, but simply a willingness to risk being called fools for having hope. It was almost an absurd sight at first. Captain Lorien wasn't alone as he cautiously approached the Stone of Ages. Beside him, the elderly archivist, Lady Mara, leaned heavily on a gnarled staff that seemed older than herself. At their flanks, and to Elowen's utter bemusement, wasn't the expected cohort of elite Valorian knights, but her old nemesis, Aldrich, Master of Arms. To see him so far outside the fortress walls, not leading a battalion against some tangible foe, but following two outcasts. This was perhaps an even stranger omen than shadows crawling northward through the Briarwood. "A bit breezy for an evening stroll, don't you think?" Aldrich's gruff voice pierced the twilight. His bravado, Elowen noticed, faltered the closer he got, as though he finally sensed the strange undercurrent of something humming just beneath the earth's surface. Captain Lorien, ever the voice of practicality, silenced Aldrich's grumbling with a sharp look. You claim an old darkness stirred. That alone warrants investigation, even if— She cast a weary glance at Elowen. Your methods remain questionable. Lady Mara stepped forward then, the lines on her face seeming less a product of age and more like wisdom carved into bone. Our Valoria was carved from this land long before those stone walls rose. I've lived on a knife's edge between what is deemed possible and what the heart deems true. You left a note promising answers. Her voice cracked slightly then, but not from feebleness. About something monstrous beyond imagining. The tension within Elowen, coiled so tight all day, didn't snap so much as shift into a quiet certainty. These three weren't here because of trust, but because the situation defied their usual tools. Their swords offered no solace against a blight seeping into the very soul of the land. In this, even her doubters knew she was right. The what to do about it remained the great divide between them. Look, she began, stepping to the centre of the stone circle, keeping her eye on Aldrich, gauging how to gauge his scepticism into vigilance. I know how this sounds. You see a witch mumbling over stones. Perhaps that's all I am. But there's a rot in the Briarwood. Animals turned monstrous. She gestured with the weathered amulet still tucked into her pouch. It pulses here, a darkness your sharpest steel barely scratches. She saw them exchange glances, not to dismiss her, but out of concern for her sanity. They hadn't seen what she felt, not just the creeping chill from the wood, but those flickering echoes within the depths of that wardstone. Her next words held a truth she'd held back, both from herself and her audience. Something sleeps below, ancient, primal. There was an oath once forged by those who lived when this land knew a different name. Elowen hesitated then. It was foolish pride holding her back now, not fear. This wasn't her power, or even her ancestors alone. It predated their lineage. I called to them today. The old protectors. That was my folly, or possibly our only hope. Her confession hung in the stillness. Not even a breeze dared disturb the heavy quiet. Aldrich broke the silence with a sharp laugh, but it held no humour, only a strained edge. Protectors? And you speak of this calmly? Ancestors or spirits don't win wars, girl. Blades do. Perhaps. Elowen held her ground even as doubt pricked at her own resolve. Perhaps that's all that worked once. This isn't that kind of war, though. No banners to cut down, no enemy king to put a blade through. The Briarwood isn't dying. It's been poisoned, infected by something that wants to claim this land. Her voice turned pleading. Haven't you sensed it? It's not in the wind, it's in the soil itself, crawling north. And your solution is this. Lorien gestured around the stone circle. Fairy tales in the face of true evil. Elowen squared her shoulders, defiance simmering within her at their scorn. What's your solution? Valoria built walls so high against beasts and raiders. It believes this world's threats can all be held at spear's end. You forgot there are older things, those that hunger for land like yours. Your walls were not built against what stirs now. Mara surprised Elowen then. This frail-looking woman who catalogued ancient battles now stepped close enough to see the etchings upon the Stone of Ages. They weren't decipherable markings to her, but something about them held her gaze for longer than seemed logical. She's not entirely wrong, Mara breathed, her voice like rustling leaves. This land always held those who walk alongside us, but are seen only by those of willing heart, or blood. She touched the amulet at Elowen's chest with a trembling finger. This speaks of old bonds. Silence settled again, broken only by the faint eerie sound of a wolf howling, but from far too deep within the Briarwood. The sound snaked around them, as if the trees themselves whispered it in unison. Enough of this. Aldrich's barked command was an attempt to regain control in the face of mounting unease. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, not out of a true willingness to face some unseen force, but to cling to what he knew in the absence of other answers. It was Elowen who finally gently broke through his bluster. "You came, Master Aldrich," she said, an unusual softness in her tone. "For that, I'm grateful. Your courage matters more than you may think." It wasn't praise, but a simple statement of truth. They weren't here out of faith, but there was a crack widening in their certainty, enough of a gap for possibility to slip through. In their own ways, they all felt the gnawing unease beneath the surface, saw the unnatural swiftness with which the corruption claimed once familiar, safe hunting grounds. Her call wasn't just about saving lives, but in saving what once made Valoria more than just stone and sharpened steel. That spirit, perhaps a flicker of that remained amidst their wariness. The ground pulsed in an irregular rhythm, like a living heart echoing against Elowen's bare feet. There was no denying it now. She had set something in motion with her incantation within the shadowed archway. It was no longer about summoning, but about being ready for what answered her call. Lorien and Mara exchanged quick, worried glances. Even Uldric, who moments earlier scoffed at the very notion of spirits, stood rigid, his hand drifting reflexively toward his sword and finding only empty air. His blade remained back at the barracks, where it held power. Here, he realized with a dawning unease, it was about as useful as a child's stick against a tidal wave. "When?" Lorraine asked, breaking the strained silence. Elowen didn't know. All she felt was that presence swelling, building, rising in answer to her plea. Soon. When they sense enough of themselves in... She searched for the word, found it more out of instinct than understanding. In the bedrock. There was an agreement beneath the earth, one older than any treaty ever forged by kings. This pact predated humanity's dominion, and if there was hope, it resided in that forgotten promise. But there was a price. She felt it now. The pull on her wasn't just as a guide, but as a channel. Each surging pulse meant her bloodline was becoming less just hers and more theirs. This thought should have brought dread. Strangely, it didn't. She only knew, with the same unwavering certainty as a child trusting a parent's hand in the dark, that these ancient guardians wouldn't claim her entirely. They knew she was but a fragile conduit of flesh and bone, and to shatter her would be to sever the bridge they sought to rebuild into this realm. Another earth tremor ran through the stone circle. This one not just felt, but heard. This rumble from the deep wasn't an echo of an awakening heart, but of a footfall that shook the very foundation of this land. They arrived not in a surge of wind or spectral mist, but in a wave of displaced soil and shuddering trees. In moments, the circle, untouched even by the roots of the Briarwood, felt suddenly cramped. Yet they weren't figures of flesh and blood, but raw manifestations of what they embodied. There was the sentinel, a gnarled oak made sentient, its bark eyes aglow with verdant life, and a being woven of moonlight and water shimmering into a humanoid form near the edge of the circle. Elowen's ancestors had never truly faced them head-on, but walked these lands beside them, with only reverence as their shield. Even Uldric the scoffer dropped to his knees, not in worship, but in the raw realization that some things couldn't be fought, only weathered. They stood amongst living legends, and within Elowen's thrumming pulse she felt it. Not their gratitude, but an assessment, their ancient eyes settling not just on her, but on the kingdom sprawling to the south. There were no spoken words, but Elowen acted as their intermediary, the pact echoing through her spirit to translate their intent. These guardians, ancient as the hills they were born from, saw beyond the immediate blight of the Briarwood. The shadow that seeped, that poisoned, was not some natural occurrence. It was an echo of ancient conflicts they understood too well, but that humanity's short memory had largely erased. This darkness, festering just beyond Valoria's border, was a scout, testing the world's defences, preparing the way for its masters. But they had another, older name for these encroaching shadows, one passed down in Elowen's whispers of forgotten lore, the Tainted Ones. It came through in fragments, as though their speech could not truly form in the air as easily as their bodies wove themselves into existence. Yet their intent was chillingly clear. The threat wasn't the blight alone, but its source, its true goal. And to extinguish these old ones forever, to leave this world defenceless for a true takeover. The Briarwood was but their opening gambit. With it corrupt enough, Valoria, that last bastion of resistance in the region, would fall effortlessly without the Guardians to halt the march of the Tainted Ones. This, Elowen realized, was what their ancestors' pact was born from, not servitude, but the desperate alliance between those who walked on two legs and those who grew as ancient and mighty as the earth itself. For long ages this oath lay dormant, forgotten, while Valoria rose triumphant under its protection. But with their victory came complacency, and it was that, as much as the encroaching shadow, that drew the ancient protectors here now. They sense weakness, Elowen's voice barely cut through the heavy silence, not that of the Tainted Ones, but of humanity. Valoria focused on borders and blades, forgetting that true strength, when threats like this stirred, rested on an echo of that first alliance. For a chilling moment, Elowen heard her own heartbeat mimicking the pulse of the earth spirits. Each pulse was not just a measure of time, but a warning that it was running out. Weakness within, not without, the moonlit water spirit shimmered near, and through Elowen its words came, not harsh but an indictment born of millennia, where it saw decades as mortals counted years. Valoria had forgotten this. Its strength did not come just from within, but from the land itself. To sever that bond through neglect was the folly that gave the tainted ones their advantage. This was a war they should never have needed to fight, not alone. Elowen understood that in their absence, in Valoria's blind pride, this land that once offered shelter became contested territory once more. And now she was the hinge upon which a forgotten world, not a dream but one just at the edges of perception, hung in precarious balance. There was a grim shift in the spirit of the oak, not anger, but a sense of purpose galvanized. "What of your kind?" His rumble, echoing through Elowen like distant thunder, sent another tremor through the ground. Their focus narrowed onto the lights of Valoria flickering in the dusk. Valoria had forgotten it owed an old debt, but with that lapse came a question as urgent as any battle plan. Where do their loyalties lie now? Was the pact broken beyond salvation, or did defiance against this encroaching darkness still smoulder amidst the stone halls and sceptical hearts? I cannot speak for them. Elowen stumbled over the words. What right did she have? Only they can earn back your trust. That will take time. And that, more than any weapon, was in perilously short supply. They understood this unspoken plea, though it clearly disappointed them. For all their strength, these ancients knew there was another power here, the spirit of free will, of defiance, of even foolish courage. In their long existence they'd seen this flickering flame bring down forces that dwarfed their own physical might. But to fan it back to life would require trust on both sides. One Valoria was proving slow to earn, and one the Guardians now realized they desperately needed to extend. Aldrich finally found his voice, not in challenge, but with a hint of awe and fear fighting for dominance. These beings, will they fight on our side? His use of our spoke not of some new shared kinship, but desperation. He saw what Elowen did. These spirits' raw might wasn't a simple tool, but a chance at reclaiming the strength they'd forgotten was always woven into the very foundation of their world. Their answer came subtly, more intent than direct speech. The water spirit drifted towards the heart of the Briarwood, shimmering starlight illuminating the faintest hint of its path. As if in response, the rotting, twisted trees writhed in unnatural agony, black ooze seeping like sap, where tendrils of moonlight touched them. A single gnarled oak, still bearing a flicker of verdant life within its blighted core, swayed as if offering support for the struggle unseen by anyone but the water spirit. With a burst of shimmering energy, the corruption surrounding the ancient tree began to recede. There was no bloom of vibrant life, but a halting of the insidious decay. It was not a sign of victory, but of proof. There was a war here beyond even what most of Valoria understood. This display sent a new shiver through human veins, to face not hordes of monstrous creatures, but an insidious power leaching into the earth itself. This was the heart of why Elowen had done the unthinkable, risked being branded traitor or mad to awaken these echoes from legend. Her final hope, and perhaps Valoria's last true weapon, now stood before them. They needed to be not just allies, but reminders of an old bargain, one carved into the heart of this land and echoed in her blood. She was their lifeline now to both sides she straddled, the human world of doubt and steel, and the unseen heart of the land itself beating in time with her own. Failure wasn't a thought she could allow. There was no if, only how to bridge this growing divide before the tainted ones, sensing victory near, broke through whatever thin barrier lay between the Briarwood and Valoria's walls.